Hi there, my name is Dr. Buckley, and if you are watching this video, you have made the absolutely stupendous decision to participate in my memory lab at Mercer University as a research assistant. So the objective of all of the videos in this playlist is basically to familiarize all of my research assistants with some of the psychological phenomena that I investigate in my lab. So this video is going to focus on something called cognitive offloading. Okay, so we'll start out by talking generally about what cognitive offloading is, and then we'll sort of zoom in or focus on cognitive offloading in a specific type of task or paradigm known as the saving enhanced memory paradigm. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so one of the questions I always ask my research assistants before they start working in my lab is I give them kind of this hypothetical scenario. So if you filled out the introductory survey that I asked you guys to fill out the first week of classes, one of the questions was, if you lost your phone and needed to call someone to help you get home, how many people's phone numbers would you be able to recall from memory? Do any of them live close enough to drive to Macon and pick you up? And I don't know about your individual experience, but most of the time when I ask students this question, very few of them are able to generate any of the phone numbers that are stored in their cell phone from memory, with the exception of maybe their significant other or their parents or siblings. And in many cases, those individuals don't live close enough to actually be able to pick them up. So this is really quite a interesting or compelling demonstration of the potential consequences of technology, right? So on the one hand, our technology is very helpful to us in the sense that we are able to free up our cognitive resources or our mental processing power, right? So we're able to focus more of our own personal processing power on other things, right? So we don't actually have to memorize, 150 different phone numbers or keep a phone book in our nightstand drawer, right? Our cell phones take care of that for us. So one of the most interesting quotes with respect to cognitive offloading that I've come across is from the philosopher Andy Clark. And this is a quote from Clark. He essentially argues that all Homo sapiens are natural born cyborgs, able to seamlessly integrate tools and artifacts into our cognitive ecology to enhance our mental faculties, right? So this can include everything from neural implants and prosthetic sensory receptors and things like that, right? So sort of the things that we typically couch within fantasy or science fiction, right? So another example of fantasy or science fiction is from The Matrix, right? So the main character in the Matrix film basically uploaded a computer into his brain so that he wouldn't have to retain all of that information using his own faculties, right? So those are kind of fantastical examples that don't really have a basis in reality. But what does have a basis in reality is something like a grocery list, right? And even that example might be a little dated now that we all have Instacart, right? And we can order our groceries online, which is another example of cognitive offloading. But even something as simple as physically writing a grocery list and going to the store is an example of cognitive offloading as well. Okay, so I'm throwing around that word a lot. What do I mean by cognitive offloading? Cognitive offloading simply refers to the act of reducing the mental processing requirements of a task through physical actions like writing down information or storing information on a cell phone or computer. Okay, so anything that allows us to selectively reduce the amount of information we have to remember, okay, is referred to as cognitive offloading, right? So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of experiments that have demonstrated cognitive offloading, right? So Hinkle 2014 found that participants on a museum tour remembered less about objects they were instructed to photograph than about objects they were simply instructed to observe, right? So what these findings provide very compelling evidence for is that when people expect to have future access to information that they've cognitively offloaded, right, they may expend fewer cognitive resources trying to remember that information on their own, right? So because participants in this experiment were told to take pictures, right, they understand the way a camera works and the way that film is stored. So they assumed, okay, I don't have to pay as much attention to this object or picture because I'll have access to it later, right? So that demonstrates in a very compelling and elegant way one of the primary benefit of cognitive offloading is that we ease the processing burden that we have to tax our memory system with. Okay, another example, Sparrow, Liu, and Wagner conducted a similar experiment where they had participants type a series of 40 trivia statements into a computer, and the participants were led to believe that the computer would either save or delete that information. Okay, and when they tested participants' memory for those 40 trivia statements, they found that participants who thought the computer erased the trivia file, okay, remembered significantly more of those 40 statements than those who believed the computer had successfully saved them, right? And this pattern was actually found whether or not participants were explicitly instructed to remember the statements. So even when they were told, right, even if the computer saves the statements, we want you to remember them, they had the same effect, right? So simply the expectation that digitally stored information could be accessed in the future, okay, was enough to um, cause this different pattern, right? Where information that participants believed they would have access to later was less well remembered than information they believed had been deleted, right? So even when we're told explicitly, don't offload the information, continue to try to maintain these items in memory, right? The urge is overwhelming to offload when we know that the technology is reliable. So even though we're told to continue to use our own processing power, we actually use less of it when we know that we have some digital analog. Okay, so this relates, so now we're going to focus on a particular type of cognitive offloading or a particular consequence of cognitive offloading, which is saving enhanced memory, right? So prior research has demonstrated an interesting consequence of cognitive offloading known as saving enhanced memory, okay? And saving enhanced memory represents kind of a shift in the literature, right? Because the previous two experiments that I've shown you, right, has demonstrated kind of the negative consequences of cognitive offloading, right? And the negative consequences that our memory for offloaded information is considerably worse, right? By virtue of the fact that with cognitively offloaded information, we're reducing our own processing demands, and instead we're using an external storage system or a digital analog, so that we don't have to tax our own memory system, right? So that could be argued as a deficit, right? Or a negative consequence. On the other hand, using an external memory system might also confer a cognitive advantage, right? And that's because um, if our cognitive resources aren't being bogged down by the offloaded information, right? That could mean that our capacity for remembering new information might be enhanced, right? So, yes, our memory for the cognitive offloaded information, okay, is going to be reduced, but our capacity for remembering new information could be improved, right? Because our memory system isn't going to be taxed holding on to that cognitively offloaded information. Okay, so that's this idea of saving enhanced memory. So we see that when participants are prompted to save a subset of information, whether they're taking a physical list of words and putting it into a folder, or whether they're using a digital storage device like a flash drive, right? If they offload the information prior to studying new information, the newly acquired information is better remembered, right? And this benefit occurs because participants who offload the old information, either by saving it in a physical folder or saving it on a flash drive, okay, that means that that information, because it's no longer maintained in memory, okay, it's basically going to save up cognitive space. That's one way to think about it. But more accurately, it's going to prevent that old information from interfering with the learning of new information, right? And there's a particular name for that, right? So in memory, we call that proactive interference, right? So proactive interference, let me give you an example, and then we'll talk about the definition again. So one of my favorite examples in a text that was written by an incredibly famous and talented memory theorist by the name of Michael Anderson, okay? So the example that Dr. Anderson gives for proactive interference is the very socially awkward and unfortunate uh, scenario where one might refer to their current significant other by their previous significant other's name, right? So obviously that is a social faux pas and can get you into all sorts of trouble, but it also demonstrates the processing limitations of memory, right? Whereby new information becomes harder to recall because of the influence of previous information, right? So again, memory is a limited capacity system, which means anytime we're tasked with learning new information, there's the potential for old information to impede that process, right? So that's proactive interference. So what happens with cognitive offloading is by utilizing a digital storage device um, to use as an external storage system rather than relying on our memory, right? We offload information, and the act of offloading that information is going to prevent that interference from previous information when we're trying to learn new information. Okay. So, in the original experiment demonstrating this phenomenon, that was conducted by Dr. Benjamin Storm and his graduate student, Sean Stone. Okay, they had the following scenario. So in this experiment, participants essentially conducted a bunch of mini experiments. So that's what I mean by trial, is kind of a mini experiment. So in this procedure, participants had to memorize two lists of common nouns, okay? And the first list was referred to as List A, and the second list was referred to as List B, okay? So participants had to memorize two lists of concrete nouns before being tested on their memory for both lists. And on half of the trials or mini experiments, participants deleted List A before attempting to study List B. On the other half of the trials, participants saved List A into a folder on a flash drive before studying List B. Okay? And so this was the cognitive offloading condition. If they saved the List A onto the flash drive, that meant that they would be able to restudy List A before being tested on it. Okay? So in that case, they were able to offload the information contained in List A rather than committing it to memory and having to maintain that information. Okay? Participants were then tested on their memory for List B first, followed by List A. Okay? So if you've been tracking with me so far, what is our prediction, right? So our prediction is that, again, participants who are able to save that information on an external storage device, which in this case is a flash drive, right? They're not going to suffer from that proactive interference, or the information from List A is not going to make it harder for them to memorize the second list or List B. Okay? So while their memory for List A is going to be worse because they offloaded that information instead of maintaining it in their own memory system, right? Their memory for List B is going to be better, right? As opposed to participants that deleted List A, right? If they deleted it, they won't have access to it later on, which means they can't restudy it, right? So their memory for List A is going to be better than the individuals who are able to cognitively offload it, right? Because they had to maintain that information in memory. But their memory for List B is going to be worse because all of the information they're still holding in mind from List A is going to interfere. So yeah, so people remembered more words from List B when they had saved List A than when they had deleted it. Okay? But this was only the case when the saving process was deemed to be reliable. Okay, so in this particular paper, they manipulated whether saving the list actually successfully resulted in restudy. So they had one condition where the saving of List A didn't work. Okay, and so they weren't able to restudy it. And so when the saving process or the external storage device of the flash drive was deemed to be unreliable, okay, in that case, participants began to maintain that information in their memory instead of offloading it because they couldn't rely on the flash drive to keep a record of that information. Okay. Okay, so again, in other words, saving List A appears to reduce the effects of proactive interference, okay, on the delete trials. Okay, So in the advent or aftermath of Storm and Stone, one important question that remained is whether the cognitive consequences of memory offloading were exclusive to digital technologies like a computer and a flash drive, or whether they generalized to other types of cognitive offloading. For example, like writing something down with a pen or in a notebook. So subsequently, um, two researchers, Flusberg and Ramos, decided to do a replication of Storm and Stone, but instead of having participants delete the items or save them onto a flash drive, they had a physical folder, a manila folder, versus a shredder. Okay? So if you were a participant in this experiment, first, you would be handed a sheet of paper with 8 words on it. Okay, that was list A. And you would study it for 20 seconds. And then you would be prompted to either save the information in a folder, okay, which meant you would be able to restudy list A for 20 seconds before being tested on list A. Or you were prompted to shred list A in a physical shredder. Okay. So if you saved it into the folder, you could physically take it out of the folder and restudy it for 20 seconds before being tested on list A. Right? But if you shredded it, it's gone, right? It's destroyed. So what that means is you wouldn't be able to access it again or restudy it. Therefore, you don't have the option of cognitively offloading it, and you have to maintain those items in memory, right? So subsequently, after either saving or shredding list A, participants studied list B for 20 seconds, the new list of words, and then they counted backwards by threes for 20 seconds. So for example, if they were given the number 200, they would count 197, 194, etc. for 20 seconds. Okay, and this was just a distractor task. And then they were prompted to recall all the words they could remember from list B, right? So remember what our prediction is. Let's start with list A, right? So individuals who were able to save list A and restudy it right before the test, right? They're going to offload the information rather than taxing their own cognitive architecture or their own memory system. They're going to use an external storage device of the folder, right? So rather than relying on their own memories, right, they're simply going to rely on the information being stored in the folder. Okay. In contrast, individuals who are prompted to put it in the shredder, right, they can't cognitively offload the information, right, because the list is physically gone. Okay. So they are going to utilize their own cognitive architecture or their memory system to maintain that information, right? So if we look at the mnemonic consequences, right, for list A, right, we know that those who put the list A in the folder, right, their memory for list A is going to be much poorer because they're not actually utilizing their memory for that information as compared to those who shredded the list, right? Their memory for list A is going to be much better. Okay. Now, but the consequence that we're interested in for saving enhanced memory is what happens to list B, right? And again, our prediction is that list B recall is going to be the inverse of list A recall, right? So list B recall is going to be better for the people that saved list A because they're not going to have the proactive interference that builds up, right? So they're not going to have to hold in mind list A while they're trying to learn list B. In contrast, people in the shredding condition that weren't able to offload list A, right, they're going to have to hold in mind list A while learning list B, which is going to create that interference. And that's exactly the pattern that the authors found. So, Flusberg and Ramos found that on average, people remembered more words from list B when they saved list A and thus cognitively offloaded the information than when they shredded list A, okay? And thus had to maintain those items in memory. Okay, so one interesting question, now that we know what saving enhanced memory is, right? And we know more generally about this phenomenon of cognitive offloading, is do people differ with respect to how well they cognitively offload information, right? So are there differences between people in how well they're able to um, offload information when they save it into the folder or onto the flash drive, right? Because one hypothesis is that maybe people that frequently engage in cognitive offloading in their normal life might show an even bigger saving enhanced memory effect, right? So, for example, people that use their cell phones to remember or to maintain all sorts of information, or people who always write grocery lists, right? Um, so one of the things that Flusberg and Ramos did is they attempted to devise kind of a survey to look at individual differences in saving enhanced memory. And what they wanted to see is, are some people more apt to cognitively offload than others, right? So for example, one of the questions they asked is, do you take notes in class, right? So presumably people that take a lot of notes during class, that's a form of cognitive offloading, right? So that's a way, writing everything down in class, right, means that you don't have to maintain that information in memory and you can simply refer back to your notes later. Similarly, do you take notes at home, right? Do you have a planner where you keep track of all sorts of appointments and homework assignments, or keep to-do lists of all the items that you need to complete, right? What method of note taking do you use, right? And so they thought maybe these questions would elucidate in some way people's capacity for cognitive offloading. But this is a quote from the article. So we also conducted a series of exploratory analyses to determine whether individual differences in self-reported memory abilities or preferred note-taking methods, which we reasoned would be one of the predominant forms of memory offloading in our student sample, moderated the saving enhanced memory effect. So in fact, none of these variables seem to matter, right? So when they looked at how often or whether or not people took notes and whether they used handwritten notes or typed notes, none of those factors seem to predict the magnitude of the saving enhanced memory effect. Okay, so keeping this in mind, one of the questions I have that I will be investigating in my lab is are there other individual differences that might be predictive of cognitive offloading, or might be predictive of the degree to which cognitive offloading reduces that proactive interference? So one of my hypotheses is that a variable known as working memory capacity might be relevant, right? So working memory is essentially an updated notion of what Atkinson and Shiffrin in their 1968 information processing model of memory referred to as short-term memory, right? So when short-term memory was first conceived by these researchers, they assumed it was just a limited capacity system for the temporary storage of information, right? So basically anything that you're currently thinking about or paying attention to resides in your short-term memory, right? So originally, when short-term memory was conceived, it was believed to be kind of a holding cell, if you will, for all of the information that you're currently thinking about. But in fact, the updated notion of working memory says that not only are you temporarily maintaining information in memory, but you're also doing things like manipulating that information, right? So, for example, when we attempt to do arithmetic problems in our head, right, what we often do is we often project those numbers on a sort of mental blackboard, if you will, and attempt to do the figuring in real time, right? So, that's an example of working memory. We're actually manipulating the information in some way, right? Similarly, whenever we engage in the mental rotation of objects, that's a form of visual working memory, right? And also, whenever we attempt to read, right, to read prose on a page, we're thinking about what the words mean. We're thinking about the plot in the story. We're thinking about what we believe might be happening in the story, right? So that's an example of not only maintaining information in your short-term memory system, but you're also thinking about and actively retrieving information from your long-term memory system, right? And you're sort of using that information to do higher order cognitive thinking processes, right? So that's working memory, okay? So working memory not only sustains your attention with respect to what you're thinking about and temporarily stores that information, it also allows you to manipulate and use that information for higher order cognition, right? So that's working memory, right? So one possibility is that individuals with a lower working memory capacity will experience greater offloading benefits by virtue of the fact that due to their cognitive processing limitations, they're already accustomed to offloading information as kind of a compensatory or adaptive mechanism, right? So if I know my capacity for storing, using, and manipulating information is limited, and I have a really hard time doing that, I'm going to be more likely to use cognitive offloading or external memory stores whenever possible, right? But there's also an equally plausible hypothesis that actually individuals with a better working memory capacity or a higher working memory capacity will experience greater benefits of cognitive offloading, right? So maybe if I have a fairly advanced capacity for holding information in mind and manipulating or using that information, I'm going to be better, right, on each of those trials, right, in that experiment of saying, okay, this is list A, right, and I get to save that list. So I'm going to shut off my memory, okay, for that information, okay. So I'm going to offload it, and then I'm going to focus all of my cognitive faculties on remembering list B, right? So maybe by virtue of the fact that people with higher working memory capacity are better able to switch between cognitive offloading and maintaining items in memory, maybe they'll experience a better saving enhanced memory or a more dramatic saving enhanced memory effect. Okay, the last question that I'm interested in exploring in my lab is related to a phenomenon known as retrieval-induced forgetting, right? So you guys should have learned about retrieval-induced forgetting in my previous video. But retrieval-induced forgetting is basically the idea that whenever we selectively retrieve information from memory, right, the information that we actively retrieve gets remembered better, but our memory for related information that is not retrieved gets impaired, right? So remember in the Carroll et al. 2007 experiment I showed you, where participants studied two passages, right? So they studied one passage about Austin, who was suffering from schizophrenia, and one passage about Peter, who had an autism spectrum disorder, okay? And then they practiced retrieving 10 of the questions about Austin on the initial memory test, right? And then on a subsequent final memory test, they found that their memory for the 10 questions about Austin was better than their memory for any of the questions about Peter, but their memory for the other 10 questions about Austin was worse than the questions about Peter, right? That notion that the questions about Austin that they didn't study were more poorly remembered than the questions that were never practiced about Peter, right, illustrates retrieval-induced forgetting, right? So, and we have this funny paradigm where we have participants study a bunch of word pairs, right? And the first word is comprised of a category, and then the second word is comprised of an example from that category, right? So for example, our participants might study fruit, peach, sport, golf, fruit, cherry, sport, skiing, right? And then we give them a chance to practice half of the items from one of the category, just like in the Carroll et al. Study, they studied half of the 20 questions about Austin, right? And then after a distractor task, they're tested on all the items, right? Essentially, what happens with retrieval-induced forgetting is when participants are trying to, when they see that label, fruit dash PE, right? One of the words that comes to mind is peach, but so do lemon, strawberry, banana, and cherry, right? So in order to make it easier to recall peach or apple, right? Depending on what the word stem is, right? Participants are actually going to actively, volitionally, right, do something called goal-directed forgetting, where they suppress the accessibility of banana, strawberry, cherry, and lemon. Okay, so they're going to suppress those items, making them less accessible in memory, so that it's easier for them to recall the item they want to remember. In this case, peach, right? So this is another example. What happens during that initial test phase or that practice phase is the phenomenon of proactive interference, whereby all of the earlier studied fruits, okay, are going to make it harder for the participant to selectively retrieve the one that they want to practice, okay? So we know that saving items or cognitively offloading items is going to prevent or circumvent that proactive interference. So essentially the question that I am asking, right, is if we prompt people to save a list of those category exemplar pairs before practicing them, right? Is that going to prevent those earlier studied items by virtue of the fact that they've been cognitively offloaded from interfering and creating the conditions necessary for retrieval-induced forgetting. Okay, so I realize this is a lot of information and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. And of course, as always, you are welcome to ask me for any clarification at any point in time. Okay, thank you so much for watching and paying attention, and I look forward to seeing you soon.